Uh, there?
Yep,
Can you see me okay?
I can.
Great. Well, this is Crossing Crown Radio and the Gospel Truth Podcast. I'm Mike Robinson, your host, and a guest, a former co-worker with me, a minister, and his name is Anthony Rogers. And Anthony ministers as a pastor and a teacher and apologist, speaking in various places throughout the country and events, even on the internet. He's an apologist and a debater who's engaged Muslims, atheists, skeptics, and numerous formal and informal debates. Welcome, Anthony. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Good to see you.
Yeah, likewise. We got a great picture going on here.
Yeah.
That looks really good. Welcome to my channel. And what I first question for you is just give us a little bit background of yourself and your ministry, if you would.
Yeah, so I presently am serving as the regional director in South Carolina for Metanoia Prison Ministries. Unique situation. I'm a pastor, but don't pastor in a particular church. I pastor throughout the state. And of course, that's very different than the norm. It involves all sorts of different things, but it involves going into the prisons, also attempting to minister to people's family members outside the prison, since of course the people that are in the prison are going to be returning to those families, hopefully, if, in the case of those that have families. So Metanoia is a branch of MNA, which is Mission to North America, the PCA's missions agency, the Presbyterian Church of America. So that's what I do. It's something that I've long desired to do, and I think probably will come up again in some of the subsequent dialogue because it's related to other things like my interest in apologetics and all that kind of stuff. So, and my testimony. So.
Oh, what general area of the country do you live in, and what are the spiritual needs of that area? Do you know?
So I live in South Carolina, so it's the Bible Belt, and it's very different than anywhere I've ever lived. As you know, I was born and raised in California until I was about 17, then moved to Las Vegas and lived there for the better part of 20 years, aside from a couple years when I went away to college in Virginia. But those are both, in California, it's just one rolling city in a sense, city on top of city. And Vegas, of course, is a big city. So I was raised in big cities. Out here, things are a bit more spread out, but also the spiritual climate is a lot different. There is all sorts of, because California and Vegas are so big, you can find things there. But out here, there's a lot more of it, packed in. It's more dense. And that means even the non-Christians in the area tend to be very different because they're influenced a lot more by Christianity. So there's a lot more common grace here. Of course, one of the challenges that presents is anytime you have a group of people that have grown up around Christianity, there's a kind of apathy. There's the presumption that we're okay, we're good, decent, moral people. So there's that thing. But of course, in other areas, the challenge is people can be more hostile, at least more outwardly hostile to the gospel because there's no real sense of Christianity in their thinking. So that gives you some insight into it. But as an example, since I'm a Presbyterian, in Las Vegas, when I lived there was hardly any, Presbyterian presence there, and there were a couple of attempts. As you know, there were attempts there to get some things off the ground, and it just wasn't ripe for that out there. But out here, there's like 30 PCA churches within 20 square miles. I could walk to the left or right and go to church. And in fact, it's very helpful now during COVID when I'm not. So even though I pastor in the prisons, because of COVID, they're locked down right now. So I have to do a lot of stuff behind the scenes, administrative type stuff, as well as correspondence type stuff, talking to prisoners on the phone, through emails, all that. But that means I also have opportunity to go and preach for pastors when they're out. So people will contact me and say, hey, I'm not going to be in town. I need somebody to cover for me. So I get to go and preach a lot of places. But when I'm not doing that, uh, we have a younger child, as you know. Our youngest daughter is ill, so she's immunocompromised. And so, because of the COVID situation, we've tried to be very careful. And that has meant, when it comes to going to church, there's a local church here that meets out on their soccer field. They have three services, so one meets out on the soccer field. That's really really convenient for us. We just and because there are so many different churches, there are those sorts of opportunities. And not just, I put a lot of emphasis on the PCA, but one other difference about this area is in places like Vegas, it didn't matter what name was on the church. There was usually not a lot of good stuff going on in places. Out here, I'd be comfortable walking into most churches. It doesn't matter again, whether it was non-denominational, Baptistic. Obviously, I'd have some differences, but for the most part, they're going to be sound, orthodox, and people walking with Christ. So uh, I love it out here. Although, anybody who loves witnessing and so forth would also miss having an environment where there's so much opportunity. Not that there's none of that here, but you can take for granted if you walk out in the street in Vegas, you're mostly going to run into non-Christians. Um, Out here, you're probably going to meet people that either are Christians or think they are. So,
Yeah, I understand. I obviously came from California, Hawaii, Las Vegas to Texas, and we moved in this real small, really Bible-based town. It's like everybody's a Christian pretty much. And what I noticed was the friendliness, the warmth, and the love of people that you didn't even know. So when I first moved here, I come out of the gym, I'm in my workout gear, all buffed out, right? And I go to a fast food place to get something. And as I walk into the door, this guy rushes by me. And I'm thinking, okay, got my Las Vegas protection mode on, right? He rushes by me so he can get the door for me. The door for me. I didn't have my hands full, and I'm like I said, I'm in my workout gear, so I look like I'm in pretty good shape and strong. And yet I've had more doors open for me out here than my entire life combined. So
mm,
if a Bible-based culture is really cool. It's yet, like you said, the witnessing. There's not as much fruit out there that's ready to get saved. So that can kind of bet. Now, you mentioned a little bit of your life. Do you remember the year that you and I met? Was it 1999, 1998? Do you remember what year it was?
no, it was sooner, and I remember it pretty vividly because for a couple of reasons, and this ties in with how I became a Christian and so forth. But I was converted in prison in 1993, and I can say more about that in a minute if you want. But I was converted there through the ministry of a gospel minister. He was out there preaching at the prison. I was an 18-year-old kid. We had just moved there from California about a year ago to Vegas. I got in trouble, went to prison, and that was for stealing a car, just engaging in thug-like activity. And uh, I got out 2.5 years later when I was 21, and you were one of the first people I met. So I was already a Christian at this time. I was converted in the prison, and I hit the ground running when I got out of prison. I was at a bookstore. It was a Barnes and Noble bookstore,
Actually, Borders.
or Borders. I'm sorry, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
Borders. I think it was the one on Decatur.
Yep.
And I remember that I was in the it's actually pretty funny. I was in the religious section, and one of the employees was taking a a customer to the area. The guy was saying, "Are there any religious books here like the Bible, but not the Bible, right? I don't want the Bible or anything else, right?" And so they were talking, and I'm already thinking, how can I get into this conversation? And I don't remember exactly how I got into it, but the whole time I'm talking with the employee and the customer, eventually the employee leaves, but the whole time I'm talking with them, I see this person's head popping up from the other side of the bookshelf. Just, it kind of reminded me of Home Improvement, right? I never really watched the show, but I always remember that
The
that
neighbor.
part of it. And so I was like, I'm thinking the whole time I'm thinking I'm getting two for the price of one, right? I'm witnessing to this guy, but this other person's hearing me. So I was all jazzed about that. And then you came along and maybe it was 10, 15 minutes after I was talking, you came and interjected too, and then that's how we met. So you were the first person I met on the outside, and we quickly formed a friendship. And it was shortly after that, I think it was the next year, we started going to Manti together to witness to Mormons.
I think you went right away to Manti, like within a week or two.
Maybe that was it. Oh yeah, it
I
was.
gave you, yeah, I gave you my card with my phone number. I didn't think you'd necessarily call, but I said, call me. And I told this guy named Johnny O about this guy I met, and I want to invite him to Manti. He said, yeah, do it. So it was pretty quick. I don't know if it's weeks or months or days, but it was pretty quick afterwards. But yeah, let's get back to the interview. One thing people probably know is that obviously that you're a pastor, you're equipped as a pastor and as a scholar. You did a lot of work with atheists and skeptics for years and years. What brought you into a ministry that really aims at refuting Islam and reaching out to Muslims? What was that turning point?
Yeah, so when I went to prison, and this is why I said it would probably tie in with other stuff in the conversation. When I went to prison, I was overjoyed when I heard about the forgiveness of sins. It was incredible to me. And I just assumed everybody else would be excited too. Uh, I was very naive, I just didn't imagine people would be upset that I was telling them that they could be forgiven and assured of heaven. And that quickly turned my evangelistic efforts in an apologetic direction. I mean, I don't think those are two different things per se, but there's a difference in emphasis there for sure. And so I was surrounded by people in the prison who were professing everything under the sun. And of course, people by nature are religious, right? But they're also fallen, so they suppress the truth, and they do so by means of these other religions that they adopt. They're looking for a way to pacify their conscience while not ultimately repenting and turning to God. And so that takes a number of expressions. So I was surrounded by members of the Nation of Islam. I was surrounded by actual Muslims, Sunni Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Christadelphians. I heard of religions. I haven't met people from some of these religions since leaving there, like Ekankar, religion most people have never heard of, but everything was there in the prison.
Let me interrupt you for a second. That just shows the election of God, that you're in the midst of this whole stew of religions, and yet God kept his hand on you to lead you to the biblical truth.
Yeah, and it gave me a love for apologetics and everything else. So as a result of that, my desire to minister was born, but also my long-term, love for evangelism and apologetics. And again, I mean, you talk about, God's election and providence. It was providence that led me to meet you almost as soon as I got out of the prison, because we did a great deal together along these lines. And a lot of, I was a young Christian still at the time when I met you. And so I don't know how long it would have been until I had really gotten an idea for going out and witnessing, like I always would have been the person, anytime I ran into somebody, I'd have wanted to talk to them, but just, I don't know when it would have occurred to me, hey, go out on the streets and start hitting the marketplaces or wherever. But, so over the years, a lot would depend on what sorts of people I was running into the most. That would sort of determine the direction of what I was really focused on and studying. So one thing about Vegas is there's a sizable Mormon population. So I studied Mormonism a lot and talked to a lot of Mormons. There were also a good number of Jehovah's Witnesses, so I talked to a lot of them. As far as atheism, I remember it was, I think it was around 95 or 96 that some people came up to the church I was at from California. They were members at a church down there that Greg Bonson used to pastor. And so they had all these tapes from Bonson, and they were just sharing them with people in the congregation. And I heard his Stein debate. It was probably, I think it was my first introduction to Bonson. And in listening to the debate, there were things that I understood and there were things that I didn't understand. But what was interesting is the things I understood were powerful, and the things I didn't understand, I could still understand they were devastating just by how incapable Stein was. You could tell he was stumbling. You could hear the audience's reaction. So, I mean, remember, I went into prison as an 18-year-old kid, and you can imagine prior to that, I probably wasn't academically oriented. I wasn't living a very studious life. So, hearing this sort of thing for the first time, I was only partially getting things, but it was enough to really whet my appetite. And so I started picking up philosophy books, getting other things by Bonson, and and of course, it helped that I knew you. You had a common interest. We would talk about these things. And so when we would go out witnessing, we would also run into atheists, agnostics, your garden variety skeptics and pagans of all sorts. So that's part of it. And then, of course, there's always, when you're evangelizing, there are always issues that come up like evolution and all of these other things. So I studied science, the philosophy of science. Yeah, all those things really impacted it uh, and pushed me in certain directions.
Yeah, we were kind of like witnessing buddies and book buddies. We have at least one book with us. You're the only guy I've ever met besides me. I'm sure there's others, but
Yeah.
everywhere you went, especially pre, smartphone usage, where you couldn't get the books on your phone, always a book. I prefer paperback, hardback versus reading on the phone. So I'm still always going out there with at least one book. I keep them in my car all the time. What if I get stuck somewhere for an hour, right?
Yeah, I end up it's the same way for me. I'm too used to reading books, too used to being able to highlight and other things. Also, remembering where things are. When you see things on an electronic device, it's just not the same. If I go back to look for something, I know people have, tools like if they have Logos or something. I don't have any of those Bible software programs, but I know people can easily search for things and uh, but in my experience, I've always just had a good ability to remember where I read something. If it's in a book and I could turn back to it, even 20 years later, I have a good kind of idea where this was at in this book if I'm looking for something. And I'll pull up stuff on my phone because there are occasions when I'll read it, but for the most part, like if I were to pull up uh, my web browser on my phone, there'll be a bunch of tabs open, and they've probably been open for months because I don't end up reading them. They just sit there, and but uh,
Yeah, that's a habit. Certain habits are hard to die. Let's now that we're here, let's get into Islam because that's I don't know if you would put it this way, but probably your main focus in your apologetic ministry. Obviously, you're pastoring and doing other scholarship, but just for our listeners that may not know the difference because they hear it, give us a basic idea of the difference between Sunni Islam and Shia.
yeah. So my primary focus is on Sunni Islam because the number of adherents that would profess to be Sunni is about 85 to 90%, which means there's only about 10 or 15% Muslims in the world. And Shia Muslims then are also not as well, widespread. So you'll find Shia mostly in places like Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, India. They're a majority in places like Iran. Those other places, they just have a significant contingent of adherents there. Lebanon, Bahrain, but for the most part, everywhere you go, it's going to be Sunni Islam. And of course, the most vocal Muslims are the Salafi Muslims, the Saudi Arabian type, because they've got all that money behind them, so they end up having a lot of support and are able to be very vocal. So that tends to be the focus, uh, not solely. If I ran into a Shia Muslim, I'd engage him too. But among the differences that makes it a very different thing is uh, while both groups hold to the Quran as the speech of Allah, they don't have the same traditions in addition to the Quran, which has a big impact on how you interpret it, The Quran, as anybody who's read it knows, is an incredibly ambiguous book. It boasts about being clear, but it's the last book on earth you'd think to call that if it didn't use that language. So Muslims will call it clear, but it's just not. And so the traditions have a huge role to play in how the religion develops. And the Sunni Muslims will hold to, standard hadith collections, hadith meaning traditions like Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim. There's six of them, Abu Dawood, At-Tirmidhi, and so forth. So that's a big difference. Historically, the originating difference was really more just political, right? The Ali was a relative of Muhammad's, and the Muslims who supported Ali believed that he should have been his successor, that it should have been familial. And when he wasn't chosen as the first caliph after Muhammad died, they were bent out of shape over that. And then some other events happened that weren't overly thrilling to the followers of Ali. There was the incident at Karbala, the death of Ali, the death of his or of Hussein, his descendant, and but then what? So since they become separated as a result of that disagreement, and Ali does become the fourth caliph, by the way, but problem is he wasn't chosen immediately after Muhammad, and he wasn't chosen to then be the genealogical progenitor of the rest of who would succeed him, right? So the Shia Muslims believe that it's his successors, his actual descendants, who are to keep perpetuating the rule in Islam. And so when I say there's a difference in the sources they look to, the Sunni Muslims primarily look to the hadiths. The Shia will look to the Ayatollahs, who are considered the ones who come after Ali, and they're considered to be, especially pious, inspired, all these other things. And so that meant that the two religions go in a kind of different direction. They're forming differently. So as theological issues arise, they're answering questions differently. And also it should be also recognized that in Islam, even certain practices are considered huge, right? Not just doctrinal issues. Like in Christianity, those are big, right? If somebody doesn't agree with the Trinity, we'd say they're not Christian.
Right.
If in Islam somebody prays differently, right? Like the Shia pray with their hands to their sides. The Sunnis will put their hands up here or something like that, and that'll be a huge difference, right? I won't pray with this person, and so you can see that. I mean, the conflict between them can be quite sharp, and that doesn't mean that's all. The differences don't all reduce to just matters of ritual or something like that. There are also doctrinal differences. One doctrinal difference I could mention, besides the kind of idea that the followers of Ali are infallible and so forth, the Shia Muslims, if you know anything about Islam, I mean, your viewers, of course, I know you do, but um, their claim to fame is that they are strict monotheists. They believe in the absolute unity of God. But actually, the Shia hold to a much stronger version of Allah's unity than Sunni Muslims. Now, both of them end up having a notion of monotheism that ends up destroying the possibility of predication, right, or intelligibility, providing a foundation for making human experience intelligible. But just in terms of the bare claim, we believe in the unity of Allah. The Shia Muslims will say that Allah has no attributes. He doesn't have attributes because that would be a violation of his unity, and he's absolutely one. But the Sunni Muslims insist that Allah does have attributes and they're distinguishable from his essence. And that means that there is also a kind of ultimate plurality. The problem is there's also a bifurcation between Allah and his attributes because they say it's other than his essence. But so this is where you get the notion in Orthodox Islam that the Qur'an is eternal. because the Quran is viewed as Allah's speech. It's not the inspired words of Muhammad that Allah is inspiring. They're words that are dictated. And since they're Allah's literal speech, his speech can't be created. It has to be eternal. But the Quran is obviously not Allah. It's something other than Allah. So for example, you'll even hear some Muslims say Allah can't enter into his creation. That's why they object to the incarnation. But obviously, the Quran is here, so somehow his speech can be present, and that shows you just how great the divide is then between Allah and his attributes. And that's only one of his attributes. He's got many more. So if Muslims are claiming that they're absolute monotheists and others aren't, like Trinitarians, well, I mean, obviously, anybody who knows the Trinity knows this isn't what we're saying, right? This thing that I just described about Allah in the Quran, we're saying there are three persons who inhere in the same divine being, one in essence, but with the Quran. So
So
hopefully
technically on that issue, they're not strict monotheists.
no.
Trinitarians are because of the essence, but the Sunni are not. Now, are there Sunnis that also believe that Allah does not have attributes in a big way, or would that just be kind of the exception if any do?
Well, so interestingly, historically, the notion that Allah doesn't have attributes originated with a sect called the Mu'tazili. That's from the 8th to 10th century. They were actually the dominant party in Islam. So recall that Muhammad in the 7th century, and then doctrinal formulations and things are taking. That's normally how it takes place, right? In anything, you get the people that are then systematizing coming along later, right? It's the same thing with the Bible. The thing, we would argue that doctrines are present, but they're not given to you in the Bible in a systematic way, right? Like if you want to know what's God like, you don't just turn to a passage. It'll tell you something about God, but it's the whole Bible that tells you, it gives you the picture, the fullest picture that we can have this side of heaven. And that's what we do systematically. So the systematic stage in Islam, the earliest stage, at least the dominant party in the earliest stage, were the Mu'tazili, and they argued Allah has no attributes, because if you say he has attributes, then you're admitting that that there's a plurality in Allah, and they said that's shirk, the unforgivable sin. And so what happens is that's just Islam, right? That's just not, we're not talking here about Sunni Shia divide. That's just Islam. It's because the divide is not yet clearly. I mean, it hasn't yet taken its full course yet. So this is representative of Islam, but it's in Shia Islam that it continues, whereas in Sunni Islam, eventually it's overshadowed by what was first called the traditionist school. This means the followers of the Hadith, the prophetic traditions, and it was represented by people like Ahmed bin Hanbal. He founded one of the four madhabs of or schools of jurisprudence in Islam. If you hear Muslims talking about their four madhabs, Ahmed bin Hanbal was one of their famous, early scholars, and he was the one he was kind of like their Athanasius. So the Mu'tazili were arguing Allah doesn't have attributes, the Quran is not his eternal speech. Ahmed bin Hanbal was saying no, his word is eternal, right? And they were persecuting those who said that. And eventually Ahmed bin Hanbal was one of the few stragglers still holding on to it. They threw him in prison and so on and so forth. But eventually his position comes to dominate. What's odd here is that Ahmed bin Hanbal and the early traditionists not only said Allah has attributes, they said he has anthropomorphic attributes. So they would say, according to Muhammad's traditions, he literally believed Allah had a face, Allah had eyes, Allah had hands, feet, shin, side, waist. In fact, he has two hands, and both of his hands are right hands, according to the traditions. So he ends up looking kind of like one of those Hindu statues, right? I'm looking for one that says he's also green or whatever. But anyway, so um, the difference now between within Sunni ranks in terms of creed, at least in terms of what I've just been talking about, there are Ashari Muslims who will say Allah has attributes, but not anthropomorphic ones. And then there are Hanbali Muslims called that the Sufis are Hanbalis in this respect, who say that he does have those attributes. And I actually think by looking at the Islamic sources that the Salafis are right. The Quran and Hadiths do say Allah has literal anatomical features.
Either way you go, though, they got a major ontological problem in touching the one in many.
Mm-hmm.
Whichever way you go, they're in big trouble, and that could be exploited, especially if you're a Van Tillian and you understand that those kind of concepts themselves.
Right.
What now? Let's go to a little bit of different subject on that. What are some of the interesting recent developments on regarding the forming of the Quran and its transmission, with the Islamic folks still saying that it's a perfect text?
Yeah, so this has been exciting in certain ways. You probably know, or anybody who's witnessed knows, and I learned this early on. Sometimes people will just keep insisting on a point that you thoroughly refuted, and some people get frustrated by that sort of thing. But once you realize what's going on, if you're paying attention to the Bible, that people are depraved and they're suppressing the truth, and you learn just basic distinctions like there's a difference between proof and persuasion, right? Something Van Til and Bonsentalk or any good logician would teach. You can prove something that somebody's not persuaded by, but it can be frustrating to a lot of people if someone keeps insisting on something no matter what you say, in spite of your good argument and their bad argument. Well, so for years we've pointed out from their own sources that the Quran is not the perfectly preserved text they're claiming it is. But Muslims will just still keep on insisting that it's perfectly preserved. And they repeat it like a mantra, and people just buy into it. I've heard people say they were converted when they found out that the Quran is a perfectly preserved book. And I'm thinking, well, what did you do to find out that's true? And you find out they didn't do anything. They just heard the claim and they were like, well, if that's the case, then Islam's got to be, it's got something going for it, right? Um, and so, but you look in the Islamic sources and uh, first of all, you read in the Hadith about certain verses, and there's commentary on certain verses in the Hadith, the traditions. But then you look in the Quran, and those verses aren't there. So you're thinking, well, what happened to them? So you already know just from that there's something missing. Then you read of other things, like in Islam, there's the had punishments, which means the capital punishments for certain crimes. So, like adultery is supposed to be punished with stoning, and that's according to the verse, in the Hadith. It's according to the verse of stoning that Muhammad revealed. But there is no verse of stoning in the Quran. The Quran talks about, you know, whipping somebody who does that. But as you know, even when you look in the Quran, there are certain things that develop. Like at one point, people could drink, then it was discouraged, you shouldn't drink, and then it was completely forbidden. And so, even though you have this punishment being prescribed, it doesn't mean there wasn't a later, more severe punishment that Muhammad would have required. So, when you look in the Hadith and it's referring to a verse on stoning, you're thinking, well, where's that verse? It's not there. Um, and of course, Muslims practice it to this day. Why do they practice it? Well, because the Hadiths talk about it. You also have one of the most bizarre teachings of the Islamic sources. So according to Muslims, a woman is not supposed to be in the presence of a man who is. I mean, I'm not saying this part is bizarre. I don't actually agree with all aspects of this, but the bizarre part is coming. But they can't be in the presence of any man who is not their father, their husband, or near relation or something like that. Um, and obviously, I would agree in terms of modesty that women shouldn't be in certain situations, but they take this to a certain extent that it caused problems. You know, what if a woman walks into a store? There's, I don't know, so to get around certain problems, Muhammad needed to make it possible for at least certain women to be in the presence of certain men, even if they weren't related or married to them. And so, in Islamic culture or Arab culture, really prior to Muhammad, during Muhammad, women, especially in the cities, would have the Bedouin women, so the women that are outside in the deserts, they would have them nurse their children for them because they thought it was better for them, that it would help them health wise and other ways. And so that's one way Bedouin women made money because the city dwellers would the women would pay them to do that, and so they would take care of their children for a couple of years till they were weaned. Um, well, so one of the things this meant is that they came to consider any mother who suckled a child, she becomes his mother in a sense, right, by virtue of suckling. So if you have two children that aren't biologically related who are suckling from the same woman, then they are in that respect related. They had this, they nursed from the same mother. And so what Muhammad taught, here's where it gets crazy. If you have, let's say, a woman and there's a man that if they want to be in the presence of each other, and you can, because it says in the Quran only relatives or your husband. Well, then what Muhammad said was all this person has to do is suckle from this woman 10 times and he'll be considered related to her. She'll be his mother. And he says this will prevent them from engaging in any kind of illicit relations with each other. And I don't know about you, but anybody who thinks that's going to kill lust and prevent further acts of indiscretion, I think they're crazy. So so the point here though is the Quran teaches that according to the Hadith. You look in the Quran, and what you're told is that Aisha, because when Muhammad would give these revelations, they would be written down by people on whatever was at hand. Palm branches, I mean, anything they could get their hands on. And so Aisha, who was Muhammad's bride, his favorite bride, he married her when she was 6. He was in his but at this point, she would have been older now, but she has a copy of this revelation, and before the Quran is finally collected, all the pieces of it, and a goat gets into her dwelling place and eats it, right? So if you know anything about what's currently going on with David when he made the Quran, a page of the Quran into an origami goat.
And he ate it.
Well, no, that was another part, right? Earlier okay. He did that, but he made an origami goat out of it, and he said, "You understand what he was doing there because he's saying how fitting to turn this page into a goat because you are what you eat and all that." So, a goat ate the Quran. So, anyways, we already know when we look at the sources, and I've only scratched the surface, that the Quran has holes in it. Plus, you've got the fact that Abu Bakr, who was the first successor of Muhammad, was the one who caused it to be collected. But after the time of Abu Bakr, there were so many differences among those who were reciting it and among the copies that Uthman, so you go in terms of successor, it's after Muhammad, it's Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, and they're actually succeeding each other in a very short period of time because they're dying and being killed off, because they're a warlike people bent on conquest, and they're killing each other as well. So they follow each other pretty rapidly. Well, Uthman has to initiate a new recension of the Quran to get rid of all these differences. And so once he gets this standard copy made, he orders all the other copies to be burned. And so, even if Muslims wanted to say we have, our copies haven't changed, right? We go all the way back to Uthman. Well, I mean, all that means is it's been standardized since, all these other changes were burned, and even those differences arose from a Quran that was imperfectly collected because many parts of it were lost. And by the way, you can understand why Aisha might want her goat to accidentally get into her house and eat that verse about other women being able to, do that sort of thing with a man. The women didn't like this command. Obviously Muhammad and his companions probably thought, well, this is a brilliant idea, Allah. We like this. But so here's the point though. some recent developments are, Muslims have been just insisting. The Quran is perfectly preserved, even though we've got all these sources to throw in their face. But recently, some big names in Islamic circles have been admitting that there are problems. Um, and that's just been devastating to a lot of other Muslims because the way it works for Muslims is they're very authoritarian in the sense that they're not authoritarian in the sense like they have a hierarchy in, like they don't have a system like you have in the Roman Catholic Church where there's a pope and cardinals and bishops and all that. Uh, but they do look to their scholars because they are very much of the mindset that you can't really understand the Quran. Like I said, it's ambiguous, so you need your scholars to be able to figure it all out, especially if you're saying the hadiths interpret it, but the hadiths are so voluminous, you really need scholars to be able to navigate it and put a lot of that together. So they're really reliant on their scholars. So when they say the Quran's perfectly preserved, they're just parroting their scholars. So when some of their scholars now come along and say this, it's devastating to them because they're like, well, we've always just been repeating what you guys are saying, and now you're saying something else. And so the names among them are, first of all, Shabir Ali, who is well known. He is a longtime debater, and people can go online and look at his past debates and see him saying the Quran is perfectly preserved. There are no textual variants, no variants in recitation. There are no manuscript differences. There's one version of the Quran. Uh, and not only do we have Muslims admitting now, like Yasser Qadi and Shabir Ali. Yasser Qadi is, by the way, probably the foremost sheikh here in America, one of the most well known, and he is a very erudite Muslim. He's educated both in Islamic context. He was educated in Medina, but also at Yale, and so he's had the best of both worlds in a sense. And so he's you know he's a significant individual to be admitting this.
Yeah.
If anybody's competent to refute arguments against the Quran, it would be somebody like Yasser Qadi, but he's over here admitting the opposite. But yeah, so for Shabir to be admitting this now after so many years of debating the opposite is devastating to Muslims.
Mhm.
And what I was going to say also is other developments that have come to light. A lady named Hatun Tash, I do something with her once a month. She's over there in the UK. She's a bold woman for Christ. She goes to the place in UK called Speaker's Corner, Hyde
Mhm.
Park in London, where they're allowed to debate publicly. It's like a free speech zone, and or supposed to be. And uh, she went into an Islamic bookstore one time. I think she was in Africa or something at the time, and she said she wanted a copy of the Quran. And the person there says, what copy do you want?" And she says, "What do you mean? What copy do I want?" And he says, "Do you want the Warsh version or the Hafs version?" And she's like, "Well, I guess I'll take both." Right? She's a Christian. She's trying to witness, but she kind of didn't understand exactly what he was talking about. And then she went back, and she doesn't even know Arabic. And she starts comparing. This is a tedious exercise. She's comparing the letters, the dots, and she's noticing there are differences between them. And so then she's like, I wonder how many of these sorts of things there are. And so
Mhm.
she's collected upwards of 30 different versions that are currently being used in the Muslim world. And you come to find out another issue is a lot of the Islamic sources haven't been translated into English. More and more are being translated into English. So even 100 years ago didn't have access to like some of the Hadith collections unless they knew Arabic. So the more and more that comes out, the more we're able to look at what Islamic scholars are talking about and dealing with. And you're looking at these sources and they're talking about this variant, that variant. And so people are saying, what are they talking about, these variants? So apparently all these Muslims are aware of these variants even after the time of Uthman, right?
Wow.
So uh, it's just a bewildering mess now for them, and they're going crazy. They're actually, really they're bouncing off of each other like a bunch of Keystone cops, and it's just it's an interesting sight to behold because they're really kind of falling apart in a lot of ways. They're apologists.
Yeah, and that is huge. And to kind of digress to uh, Allah's, at least the Allah revealed in the Quran's ontological status, you did some work on the we passages in the Quran. A lot of people are not familiar with that. Would you be able to comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, so as you know, in the Bible, God speaks in the plural on occasion. Genesis 1:26 says, "Let us make man in our image according to our likeness." 3:22 says, "Behold, the man has become like one of us." 11:7 says, "Come, let us go down and there confound their language." So you find this language in the Bible, and I always had an interest in that, not only because of engaging non-Christian groups that deny the Trinity, and I'm here giving away that I think it refers to the Trinity for a lot of reasons, and I've got a lot of work that I've done on that if people want to look at it. But
Where can they
um,
find that? Is that on your
so
page?
I have written material on answeringislam.org. Answeringislam.org. If you go to the left-hand column, there's a selection there for individual authors. If you press on that, you can go to you'll see a bunch of names, and my name is there, and then it'll show you a bunch of my articles, and it'll be obvious which one is on the plural passages. Like I think one article is just called "Let Us Make Man," and it's like 50 pages long. And then I have another article called "Allah is neither plural nor majestic," and it's a response to the plural of majesty claim.
Mhm.
And then I have a 5-part article addressing Allah's use of plurals in the Quran. But I had an interest in this, number one, just because I'm a believer. I love the triune God, and so I love to see the indications of that in Scripture. And then, of course, I was dealing with cultic groups whose main object of attack is the Trinity. Scripture says that the natural man is hostile towards God, and so you'd expect that, right? To find in all these religions and cults that their main object of attack is the Trinity. Um, so for that reason, I was looking at it. Plus, I was engaging with a number of Jewish people over time. I mentioned the prison. When I was in prison, one of my favorite people to talk to was a guy named David. He was an agnostic Jew, but he had a good Jewish upbringing and knew Judaism pretty well. So that gave me an interest in Jewish stuff. And then, of course, when I was working in Vegas, when I first got out, I was working at a pizza parlor, as you know, and I met a Jewish girl, and she would ask me questions about Jesus. And one day I said, well, why don't you come to church and just hear the preaching? And so she was converted through that, and then we began seeing each other. And I was going around her family, and her family was livid when she got baptized. So I had now to deal with the anger of a Jewish family, and so I had even more interest now to study Jewish stuff. And so as I studied this, I realized there's nothing that Jewish people have that amounts to any cogent argument against these passages standing as a reference to the Trinity. So as an example, one interesting thing is the most popular view among people who just try and write it off as a literary device, an idiom or a metaphor or something, some kind of figure of speech. The most popular is to say it's the plural of majesty or the royal we. But you look at ancient Jewish sources that are trying to deal with this, and none of them say that. Now, they don't say it's the Trinity. I will say the earliest source does work its way into the Trinity, and I'll say that in a moment. But if you look at like the Talmud, uh, one of the things you get are just attempts to wave it away, right? Like there's a statement where it says, when Moses was writing the Torah and he came to this verse, right? And the idea is that God is telling Moses what to write, and Moses is writing it, and they're having this conversation. And so it says, when Moses got to the verse where God said, "Write, let us make," Moses stopped and says, "Lord, why are you giving an excuse here to the heretics?" And God says to him, "You write, and whoever wants to err, let him err." Right? So that's not an answer, right? That's just putting words in God's mouth, and it's basically attributing to God a non-answer, really. So it's dishonoring to God. So that's one answer. And then other Jews would say that you had Nachmanides, who said, he's a medieval rabbi who said that God was talking to the earth, let us make man. You had Nachmanides, who did him one better by saying God was talking to heaven and earth. So God, it almost in some ways sounds like, and I'm not saying it goes this full route, but it kind of reminds you a little bit of paganism when you look at when they talk about how things originate. They talk about heaven and earth getting together and having a
Mhm.
child. It just seems like bizarre stuff. But anyways, uh, so you get all these different attempts in Jewish context to account for this. When you look at the earliest interpretation in Jewish sources, this is actually uh, great stuff. This is Targum Neophiti. I didn't know you were going to ask this question, but it's relevant. I had this sitting right here. This is Targum Neophiti, which, as you know, it's a Jewish translation, an ancient translation into Aramaic, because the Jews came to speak Aramaic as a result of the Babylonian exile. And so one of the things they would do is they would interpret it in Aramaic. And so uh, that also, all translation involves interpretation. So along the way, you're getting their understanding of the text. Well, when you look at Targum Neophiti at Genesis 1:26, what's interesting is it says in the context, God is speaking to his memra, his word. It
Word.
means word. The Greek word is logos, and he was talking to his Shekinah, his glory,
Mm.
right? And then even more incredibly,
Hmm.
just to show you that this is not just, maybe um, maybe a Christian reading into it more than is there. I mean, it literally says that I can grab it. It's pretty obvious that there's no fancy footwork going on my part. But 126 says the Lord said, "Let us create man in our likeness, similar to ourselves." And then it goes on, and the memra of the Lord, the word of the Lord, created the man in his own likeness. In a likeness from before the Lord, he created him. So the memra is being distinguished from the Lord who spoke. And
Wow.
then it goes on and says, and the glory of the Lord blessed them. And the memra of the Lord said to them, be strong. And the glory of the Lord said, behold, I have given you all the herbs. And it goes on. But here's the interesting part. In the very next chapter, which, as you know, is just part of the same context, we add the division for ease of reference. But here's what it says in 2:1. And they completed the creation of the heavens and the earth and all their hosts. So
Wow.
here, the Lord, the word of the Lord, and the glory of the Lord, the Shekinah, it says they completed the creation. So that's the early Targums. Uh, so this is akin to Christianity, but later Judaism starts to react to this, obviously because it plays in the direction of Christianity. Now it's too helpful to Christians, right? So we've got to suppress all this stuff. So, anyways, I had all kinds of good reasons, even apart from the Targums, to understand those references in the Bible as a reference to the Trinity. And I won't go through that whole route. But so when I came to the Quran and I see all these we passages, I'm thinking, what's going on here? Why is Allah speaking in the plural? And as a presuppositionalist, one of the things that immediately occurred to me was, quite apart from any other thing that you might say exegetically or anything like that, or in terms of the Arabic language, if somebody wants to say this is a plural of majesty, that assumes, it rests on the assumption that somehow plurality betokens majesty, right?
Mm.
The notion of plurality speaks to fullness, majesty, right? And so those notions are associated. But if you think that Allah is absolutely one, then your concept of majesty should be consistent with it. It would be best expressed in terms of unity, not plurality. And so I'm thinking, why would Allah even employ this language, even if it was a figure of speech? Why would there be such a figure of speech at all? And why would Allah honor this figure of speech? Because it seems to contradict the fundamental claim of his unity. And so I just found that too problematic. But I also knew from reading the Islamic sources that Muhammad had come into contact. Arabia was an oral culture. People would recite things. The Arabs, the pagans would recite poetry. but also there were Jewish tribes there, and the Jews would recite their scriptures. And there were Christians as well, not as many, at least not in close proximity to Muhammad, but in other parts of Arabia, and there was some contact here and there. They would recite too. It's an oral culture, and that's what they did. And you have hadiths where it talks about Muhammad going and listening to the Jews reciting and the Christians reciting. So I just started thinking, maybe Muhammad hears this. The Jews don't know any better what this is talking about. And Muhammad picks this up and just, like crumbs off a table, as Dr. Mori would say, or like a dog picks up fleas. And he just thinks that's how God speaks. So he starts, using it. And what points this up really clearly, and I could give a bunch of, like I say, I got a 5-part article on this. But one thing that really blows the lid off of this is, so Muslims today will insist it's a plural of majesty. In the last year of Muhammad's life, he had been sending out kind of like missionaries, da'is they're called, to do dawah, their word for evangelism. We call it dawaganda, so like propaganda, because they're just out there, repeating claims ad nauseum, like the claim the Quran's been perfectly preserved, even though it's not true. But they repeat it enough, and so people buy into it. But he was sending out these da'is to witness, evangelize other people in other parts of Arabia, and they got to the southern part of Arabia, where there was the area of Najran, where there were groups of Christians, members of the Byzantine Rite, and so these Christians responded to one of these da'is, these callers to Islam, and they went up to Muhammad, up where he is in the more central area of Arabia, and they end up having a discussion, a kind of debate. And one of the questions that the Najrani Christians asked Muhammad is, if Allah is one and singular, why does he say, we decreed, we create, we this, we that? Now notice something. Although these are Christians, these are Arabs. Notice that these Arab Christians don't say, oh, it's a plural of majesty. Yeah, we recognize that. That's just how things work in Arabic, right? They're thinking, no, this doesn't make any sense, right? But they're Arabs, so why don't they just automatically think that's what it is? And what's even worse, though, is when he's questioned, according to the Sirah literature, that's the biographical literature on Muhammad, when he's questioned by the Najrani Christians, Muhammad doesn't have an answer. He doesn't answer them. He goes silent. And then we're told the next day, Muhammad came back with a revelation from Allah. In other words, Muhammad slept on it and, came back with what was supposed to be an answer. When you look at what's supposed to be the answer, it's supposed to be the first 80 verses of Surah 3, because they asked a bunch of questions. So he's supposedly answering it in these 80 verses, answering all these questions. And the only thing that addresses that particular question is Surah 3:7, where it says, there are some things in the Quran that are unclear and only Allah knows their meanings. Okay. So basically they stumped Muhammad and he had no answer, certainly not the plural of majesty. And I could go on with this and show why he had no answer and so forth. But it does show you that here's this book claiming to be perfectly clear over and over and over again. Now Muhammad's in the last year of his life, and what he had been claiming for 22 years, that the Quran is the clearest book on earth and exhaustively detailed, is suddenly ruined just through a few questions from a bunch of Christians from Najran. So now all of a sudden, something that's found in the Quran hundreds and hundreds of times ends up, by Muhammad's admission, being unintelligible. So it's not just, it's one thing if you say the book is fundamentally clear and there are some passages that are difficult and not clear. It's another thing entirely to say that it's all these weak passages are unclear, because they occur hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. So, and that's only one area of ambiguity in the Quran. So
it's powerful. I'm really glad you gave that exposition on that. And before we get to the last question, can you give the folks your Patreon page location as well as your YouTube channel? I'm going to put it on the description, but if you could verbally tell them where to go.
Yeah, so my YouTube channel is probably the easiest way for them to find it because it's usually in the description box of my YouTube videos. So my YouTube page is just called Anthony Rogers. I've never thought of a fancy name or anything. Maybe someday I'll change it. Uh, it wasn't intended to make my name, broadcasted or anything. I created a channel many, many years ago and haven't used it until recently because I've done most of my stuff on Acts 17 Apologetics channel with David Wood. But recently started to do some of my own stuff as well um, on my channel. So my channel is up and running now. Um, but it's just under Anthony Rogers. In the description box, it gives you other links to other things. Uh,
Links to Act 17 also in there.
um, no, but Act 17 is really easy to
Yeah,
find
they're big.
because,
They're big. You can go
yeah.
there and see a lot of your work too. In fact, you had a recent interview with David Wood that I watched. I watch you guys' interviews, just mainly you and him when you guys are talking when I'm in my hot tub.
Oh, thanks.
I have it really hot to where it's like very healthy for you, but it's uncomfortable. You know,
Uh,
105 degrees. So to stay in there, I got to stay kind of entertained. But let's get the last question, and I'll let you go. Sorry, we're keeping you over a little bit, but this will be the
fine.
last one. Feel free to make a short answer if you want to, or go as long as you. What is the new research on Muhammad and his possible non-existence? Is that going anywhere, or is that just like the fake idea of Jesus never existing?
Well, it is really interesting. First, I'd say this. In terms of my focus, my strategy with Muslims, I've always found it, perfect to just accept their sources, right? Because to me, they're giving you all the ammunition you need to refute Islam, right? If I were a Muslim, I'd almost want to be able to say that a lot of these sources are not reliable because, you look at the Islamic sources, according to the Islamic sources, when Muhammad first encountered a being in a cave that he later came to call Jabril in Arabic. When he first encountered that being, it wasn't a pleasant experience. In fact, Muhammad is told to recite, and Muhammad is of the mindset that those who recited, the pagan poets, were able to be so eloquent and rhetorically gifted because they were possessed by the desert jinn. So when he's being told to recite, Muslims say that it means read, but he's being told to recite. It's the same word. Um, and he says, I can't, I'm not a reciter, basically. And then this being proceeds to grab him around the throat and chest and squeeze him until he almost dies. And this happens 3 times. Each time the being releases him and tells him to recite, and finally Muhammad acquiesces. So then Muhammad flees from the cave and says, "Woe is me, I'm possessed," right? And and that's in their sources. We didn't make this up. And then he wants to commit suicide for months thereafter. He wants to commit suicide, and he goes to attempt suicide many times. And each time he goes, this being appears to him again and says, "Don't do it. You're the messenger of Allah." And so that pacifies him for a brief period until he wants to go and do it again after a moment of silence. And all throughout his career, people are saying he's demon possessed. It's in the Quran. It's like 20 times. Allah has to keep saying to people, your companion is not possessed. Muhammad is not possessed. Quit calling him possessed. He's really not possessed, right? Over and over again. And it reminds you of that line in Macbeth where it says, "The lady doth protest too much, methinks," right? It just seems like Allah is really, really going out of his way. This claim really bothers Allah. It's like a man with a guilty conscience. You walk in the room and he says, "I didn't steal your wallet," and you're like, "Huh? I didn't even know my wallet was missing. What do you?" uh, so, anyways, there's stuff like that in the Islamic sources, and I just think, heck, if you're going to tell me this is all true, then I'm going to say, okay, now bite the bullet, right? Um, but having said that, it doesn't mean that I do believe all those sources are as reliable as they claim. Uh, and there's a lot of good stuff to be said against a lot of the claims about Muhammad, the historicity of Islam, and all of that. So one person writing in this area is Robert Spencer. He's probably one of the first to popularize some of the research that's being done. And actually, I heard him say the other day that he's actually updating his work against the historical existence of Muhammad. So that'll be interesting to see what his updated stuff says. But another person that's talking about it is Jay Smith. And these are really kind of the go-to guys in terms of what's easily accessible, and they're people that are using it on the ground. They're not just scholars, in other words. They're people that are out there engaging using this stuff. So their stuff is pretty easy to get hold of. And Jay Smith is pointing out things like in Islam today, supposedly, I mean, all the mosques are when Muslims pray, they're supposed to face Mecca, the Kaaba in Mecca. Uh, that Rubik's cube over there, and so all mosques are supposed to kind of be facing Mecca, or at least inside the mosque they have, a thing that indicates the Qibla direction. Uh, so the orientation of the mosque is like that. In fact, here in town, there's only one mosque that I'm sure is here, and there might be another one that I've heard about, but there's one only a couple miles from me. And if you go over there, you'll notice it's in this parking lot, and it's really strange the way it's situated in relation to these other buildings. It just looks odd because these other buildings are facing it in a certain way, and this one's like it's just completely off in terms. There's no symmetry there, and that's because they're trying to make it face Mecca. Well, when you go out, when you go through the Middle East and other places where Islam spread, allegedly, what you find is the directions of these mosques are all facing towards Petra, not Mecca. So that's a problem, and people start wondering what's going on here. And they start pointing out a bunch of other things, right, that just seem to throw off the chronology of the Islamic claims. They throw off, uh, where stuff's supposedly happening. When you look at the Quran, it only uses the name Muhammad 4 times. And it's not even clear there that it's being used as a personal name as opposed to like a title. It means praised one. Some people have even speculated that the Quran, at least in part, was originally like a Christian work. Somebody was writing, certain things, and then, these groups, whoever got a hold of it, kind of like Joseph Smith is believed to have actually a novel that a guy was writing, and then kind of gave it his own touches, right? And so, the idea is then later they kind of spun this story to account for what was developing in these centers. And so Muhammad became a particular individual, and then a bunch of traditions start accumulating about him. A lot of Islam you look at the traditions, their most basic, standard, authoritative collections, it doesn't come until 200 years after Muhammad. He's allegedly putting down traditions that go back to Muhammad, but 200 years later, right? You look at the Sirah literature, that's the biographies of Muhammad. Again, we're talking centuries after Muhammad. So a lot of this critical material that's even used to interpret the Quran doesn't come along until later. And moreover, we talked about the Sunni and Shia. Well, they all have their traditions, and interestingly, the traditions about Muhammad and other things end up among Shia. There are traditions that point in the direction of Ali as the one who was supposed to be the successor. You look in the Sunni traditions, going back to Muhammad, it says that Abu Bakr, right, was the rightful caliph. So here are these two groups that both are claiming to be Muslims, but they have two different sets of traditions, both of which are clearly pointing in different directions. And so if these things are not coming along until 200 years later in terms of their being written down, there's a big, huge question mark over it. Like, maybe these people are just writing this stuff to craft their own narrative, kind of like, the old saying where somebody's gerrymandering a canal beneath their own feet. Somebody's saying, "Hey, look, this stream leads right to me, right, because he dug it, right? Oh, that's remarkable that all this is coming right to my feet." Well, that's basically what these guys are doing. They're like, we believe Ali is the true successor. Let's, look, all of our traditions say this. You know, all of your traditions say otherwise, but all of our traditions are hundreds of years later. So, yeah, so there is good grounds, and I've barely touched on that, but there's, you look at the coins that were minted at the time Muhammad supposedly was proclaiming himself a prophet, and they don't say the sorts of things you'd expect. It's not until later. There's just a lot of things that are really off, so we have no written stuff from that time period. We don't have references to Muhammad like we would expect. And so there's good reason to actually say there might be something to all of this, and that contrasts sharply with Jesus, as you know, right? Uh, we realize what's going on when liberal scholars try and question the existence of Jesus. What's significant here is that the evidence is so much better, even though this is all taking place, 600 years earlier.
Yeah.
Islam is at least starting in the medieval period. Certain things are a little bit further along in terms of the ability to preserve things, right? There's different materials that are being used now. There's other stuff. So for Christianity to have so much more evidence for it and so much earlier, that it just dwarfs Islam, making it look, like a pygmy, um, that's significant, right? I mean, I got a question the other day. As you know, I work also for a ministry where I answer theological questions that people have that they write into the ministry for. And this person asked a question and they said, "What evidence do we have for Jesus outside the New Testament?" My first thought was, what do you mean outside the New Testament? Because these are 27 books that are coming to us from the first century,
Right.
right? They weren't all part of one book to begin with. There are 27 witnesses, and I mean, some of them are being written by the same person, but like you have Matthew, you have Mark, you have Luke, you have John, you have Peter, James, Jude, right? All these witnesses. I don't know if I mentioned Paul, but witnesses from the first century talking about Jesus. You don't have anything like that for any figure from that time period. And then, of course, it's not limited to the books that are part of the canon. Um, but by the way, the argument that people make against the canon actually backfires against them. You guys excluded all these books from the canon. Well, then you're saying, we need to admit all this other stuff into our body of evidence. Well, you've got all these apocryphal books being written about Jesus too, so add that to the mix, right? But you also have historians. You have Josephus, you have Tacitus, you have Pliny the Younger, Marabar Serapion, just people after, individuals after individuals making reference to Jesus, and not just Jesus already at this early period, but to the followers of Jesus. So it's already this movement that's making waves, so much so that Roman officials are asking, how do we deal with these people? Because they were, Rome insisted that you could only practice certain religions that were approved, and Christianity was not yet approved, so they're trying to deal with this. And so, anyways, I mean, just there's not even a comparison there. The
Yeah. And
evidence is,
even the rabbis and the Talmud are trying to deal with Christians healing people in the name of Jesus. So
yeah,
you got all kinds of problems there. But Anthony, I'm so glad that you had time to do this. I really appreciate it. And I want all of our viewers, if you can, go to Anthony's YouTube channel, and it's Anthony Rogers. And then you can see his Patreon link there. And if you can, be one of his supporters there. But Anthony, I'm just so blessed that you were able to come here. And hopefully we can do this soon again.
yeah, it was great to be on, and anytime.
God bless you and give your family my best.
You too.
Bye-bye.